She was a struggling chef, humiliated in front of New York's elite. He was a powerful CEO who saw in her what no one else dared to see. When fate brought them together, their fight for authenticity would turn into something no one expected. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going. All right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The scent of roasted garlic and wild thyme, a warm and earthy perfume that always felt like home, was engaged in a futile, desperate struggle against the sterile, refrigerated air of the grand ballroom. This cavernous space, nestled deep within the opulent heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, felt less like a room and more like a cathedral dedicated to wealth, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into gilded shadows. Olivia Campbell, known to her few friends as Liv, felt the oppressive weight of 1,000 invisible stairs pressing down on her, a physical sensation that made the starched collar of her chef's whites feel like a chokehold, even though not a single soul was actually looking her way. She was an anomaly here, a ghost from another world gliding through a glittering sea of whispered silks, sculpted couture, and the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. Her simple, crisp linen apron, a shield she wore with pride in her own tiny kitchen, felt like a brand of inadequacy in this environment. Each hesitant step she took from the swinging doors of the industrial kitchen to the main hall was a tightrope walk between unwavering faith in her craft and sheer, gut-wrenching terror. She wasn't just carrying a platter. She was carrying the distilled essence of her life's ambition, the last viable, tangible hope she had of securing her father's future and pulling him back from the precipice of permanent disability. The low, incessant hum of privileged conversation felt like a menacing countdown, a clock ticking toward a verdict that would either validate her existence or shatter her fragile world in a single, careless instant. A waiter, moving with the silent, robotic efficiency of a seasoned professional, intercepted her and placed the first delicate plate in front of Victoria Sterling, the event's formidable host and the undisputed queen of this glittering, treacherous kingdom. Liv unconsciously smoothed her apron for what felt like the 100th time, a nervous tick she couldn't control, her fingers trembling slightly. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an unbearable, elastic agony as Victoria lifted her fork, the silver glinting malevolently under the colossal crystal chandeliers. She took a bite of the dish, a slow, deliberate, almost theatrical mastication. Her perfectly painted lips pursed in judgment. Liv held her breath, the air burning in her lungs, a single bead of cold sweat trickling down her temple, every nerve in her body screaming with the knowledge that her entire future, everything she had worked for, was hanging precariously on that powerful, demanding, and utterly unforgiving palate. Victoria Sterling set her fork down with a quiet, decisive click that echoed in the cavern of Liv's anxiety like a gunshot. A chilling silence fell over the immediate vicinity of the head table as all eyes turned to her, waiting for the proclamation. Victoria dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, a gesture of refined finality, before fixing her cold, assessing gaze not on the dish, but directly on Liv, who stood frozen a few feet away. "What precisely is this supposed to be?" Victoria's voice was not loud, but it possessed a crystalline clarity that cut through the ballroom's murmur, drawing more and more attention. Liv's own voice felt trapped in her throat, a small, frightened animal. She cleared it, the sound barely a whisper. "It's a deconstructed shepherd's pie, Mrs. Sterling. I used a slow-braised lamb shank with a parsnip and potato puree, infused with rosemary and thyme, and topped with crispy leeks." She recited the description from memory, the words she had practiced, words that felt so full of passion and life in her small kitchen, but now sounded hollow and pathetic in this opulent tomb. Victoria raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Deconstructed. She repeated the word as if it were a foreign obscenity. She then turned to the distinguished guests at her table, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "It's rustic," she declared, the word landing like a slap. "One might even say amateurish. It's the kind of thing one might expect to find in a quaint little pub in the countryside, not at the annual Vanguard Foundation Gala. It has a certain sincerity, I suppose, if one appreciates that sort of thing. But it lacks sophistication. It lacks artistry. The carefully chosen words, delivered with surgical precision, were designed for maximum humiliation. They didn't just critique the food, they dismantled Liv's identity, her skill, her very worth. The whispers started immediately, a wave of dismissive murmurs rippling out from the table. Liv could feel the blood drain from her face, a cold numbness spreading through her limbs as the weight of public shame settled upon her shoulders, heavier and more suffocating than she could have ever imagined. She was no longer a chef, she was a punchline. Across the expansive ballroom, seated at a less conspicuous table, shrouded in a calculated shadow, Julian Thorne watched the brutal spectacle unfold with a familiar sense of weary detachment. He loathed these events, these hollow pageants of performative philanthropy where the price of the champagne could fund a small school for a year. He was here because he had to be. Thorne Consolidated Holdings had underwritten a significant portion of the evening, a strategic necessity in the cutthroat world of New York real estate development. He was the CEO, the face of a corporate empire built of glass and steel, and his presence was non-negotiable. He had been idly swirling the dregs of a ridiculously overpriced Bordeaux in his glass, his mind miles away on zoning variances and structural engineering reports when the dish had arrived. Unlike the other fussy, overwrought creations that had been paraded before him all evening, this one had smelled real. The aroma of garlic and thyme had cut through the cloying sweetness of perfume and entitlement. A grounding, honest scent that had, for a fleeting moment, transported him back to his grandmother's kitchen in a small, forgotten corner of Queens. He remembered her worn, flour-dusted hands, the comforting warmth of her wood-fired stove, the simple, soul-nourishing food that was an expression of pure love. He had taken a bite before Victoria Sterling had even picked up her fork, and the effect was instantaneous and profound. The flavors were deep, complex, and utterly authentic. It was food with a story, food with a soul. It was, in a word, magnificent. And then he had watched, with a growing sense of cold fury, as Victoria, a woman for whom he held a particular disdain due to her presence on his board, had systematically and publicly vivisected the young woman responsible. He saw the chef's face pale, the flicker of pride in her eyes extinguished and replaced by a look of such profound devastation that it struck an unexpected chord deep within his heavily armored psyche. He recognized the casual cruelty, the effortless way the powerful crushed the hopeful for sport. It was the very thing he fought against in his boardrooms, the empty posturing he despised, and seeing it play out so personally, so nakedly, ignited a dormant, dangerous spark within him. Liv didn't remember the walk back to the kitchen. It was a blur of averted gazes and sympathetic, pitying glances from the other staff, each one a fresh stab of humiliation. She felt like a ghost, insubstantial and invisible, drifting through a world that had just declared her unworthy of its notice. She stripped off her apron, the symbol of her dreams now feeling like a shroud, and stuffed it into her worn canvas bag. She fled the hotel through a service exit, the cold night air hitting her face like a physical blow, a welcome shock that momentarily cleared the fog of shame. The subway ride back to her tiny East Village apartment was an exercise in holding herself together, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal pole, focusing on the screech of the train's wheels to drown out the sound of Victoria Sterling's voice replaying in her mind. Rustic, amateurish. The words echoed, each one chipping away at the fragile foundation of her self-worth. When she finally stumbled into her apartment, the familiar clutter and the scent of old books and dried herbs offered little comfort. She sank onto her lumpy sofa, the exhaustion hitting her like a tidal wave. Her gaze fell upon the pile of envelopes on her coffee table, most of them bearing the sterile, intimidating logo of the physical therapy clinic. Her father, David, a man who had spent 40 years as a carpenter, building things with his strong, capable hands, was now fighting to regain the simple ability to walk after a devastating accident on a construction site. The insurance had run out months ago, and the bills were piling up, each one a stark white reminder of the crushing weight of her responsibility. This catering gig, this one night, was supposed to be the breakthrough, the down payment on the intensive, long-term therapy that was his only real chance. "How did it go, Livy?" His voice on the phone was hopeful, and it broke her heart. "It was a learning experience, Dad," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I think it went okay." As she hung up, the dam of her composure finally broke, and she let out a dry, ragged sob, curling into a ball on the sofa, feeling more invisible and more profoundly alone than ever before. The next morning, the memory of the previous night's humiliation still clung to Julian Thorne like the scent of stale cigar smoke in a poorly ventilated room. Seated behind his enormous obsidian desk in his glass-walled office on the 58th floor, with the sprawling panorama of Midtown Manhattan laid out before him like a personal kingdom, he found himself unable to focus on the quarterly earnings reports displayed on his multiple monitors. The taste of that braised lamb, the depth of its flavor, lingered on his palate, a stark contrast to the bland, predictable world of corporate finance. But it was the image of the young chef's face, the initial spark of hope, followed by the swift, brutal extinguishing of her spirit that had burrowed itself into his mind. He was a man who dealt in concrete, in steel, in billion-dollar contracts and ruthless negotiations. He prided himself on his cynicism, a carefully constructed armor that had protected him for years in a world populated by sharks and sycophants. Yet, this small, seemingly insignificant injustice had managed to find a crack in that armor. He typed Vanguard Foundation Gala into a search engine, and within moments, he was looking at a Society blog's recap of the event. There, in a glossy photograph, was Victoria Sterling, smiling triumphantly. The caption lauded her impeccable taste. Then he found it, a mention of the caterer, a small independent chef named Olivia Campbell. He clicked on her name, which led him to a modest, heartfelt website filled with pictures of beautiful, unpretentious food. He read her story, her passion for fresh ingredients, her philosophy that food should nourish the soul. It was all there, the authenticity he had tasted in that one single bite. A slow, burning anger began to smolder within him. This was not just about a bad review, it was about the systemic arrogance of a world that valued polished pretense over genuine substance. It was the very culture of empty superficiality that he was fighting to change within his own company. On an impulse he didn't fully understand, he opened a new window and logged into his LinkedIn profile, a platform he usually reserved for cold corporate announcements. His fingers flew across the keyboard, the words pouring out of him with a clarity and passion that surprised even himself. He began to write, not as a CEO, but as someone who had tasted something real and felt compelled to defend it. Last night, I had the privilege of attending the Vanguard Foundation Gala, an evening dedicated to celebrating progress and innovation, he began, the words appearing stark and black against the white screen. Amidst the predictable pageantry and perfectly manicured pleasantries, I encountered something truly innovative. It wasn't a new piece of technology or a groundbreaking financial model. It was a deconstructed shepherd's pie crafted by a chef named Olivia Campbell. In a room full of meticulously engineered, soulless cuisine, her dish was a bay revelation of authenticity. It was complex, deeply comforting and honest. It was, without a doubt, the most memorable and expertly executed dish of the evening. I later heard it described as rustic. It seems that in some circles, rustic has become a pejorative term for anything that possesses genuine character, anything that hasn't been polished and processed into a state of bland, inoffensive perfection. This is the same mindset that stifles true creativity in our boardrooms and industries. We have become so obsessed with the slick presentation, the flawless facade, that we have forgotten the value of substance. We mistake artifice for artistry. True value, whether in a meal or in a business venture, lies not in its polished exterior, but in its soul, its integrity, and the passion of its creator. Ms. Campbell's cooking has all three in abundance. Perhaps we should all be striving for a little more rustic in our work and in our lives. He read it over once, a grim smile touching his lips. It was a direct shot across the bow, a public rebuke of Victoria Sterling and her entire world. He knew the fallout would be immediate and severe. Without a moment's hesitation, he clicked post. For the first hour, there was only a trickle of activity. A few likes, a comment from a confused marketing intern. Then, the floodgates opened. The post began to be shared first by his own employees, then by industry journalists, then by food bloggers who picked up on the drama. The comments exploded, a raging debate between those who praised his stand for authenticity and those who accused him of unprofessionalism. His phone began to buzz incessantly, the screen lighting up with notifications. Then came the one he had been waiting for. A text message from Victoria Sterling. It was curt and dripping with venom. "What in God's name do you think you are doing, Julian? You have made a mockery of my event and, more importantly, of this company's board. We need to talk now." A second message followed from his chairman. "My office, 8 a.m. tomorrow. Explain yourself." Julian leaned back in his chair, the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of scattered diamonds. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He had just thrown a grenade into the heart of his own carefully constructed world, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly, exhilaratingly alive. The boardroom at Thorne Consolidated was a place designed to intimidate. Located on the top floor, it was a symphony of cool grey marble, gleaming chrome, and a single, colossal mahogany table polished to a mirror shine. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a godlike view of the city, a constant reminder of the power wielded within these four walls. When Julian walked in at precisely 8 a.m., the atmosphere was thick with a palpable hostility. The chairman, a stern man named Arthur Vance, sat at the head of the table, his face a stony mask of disapproval. To his right sat Victoria Sterling, her expression radiating a triumphant fury. She had him now, she believed. He was cornered, his impulsive act of defiance leaving him exposed. Several other board members, all allies of Victoria, were present, their faces a mixture of anger and confusion. "Julian," Arthur began, his voice low and dangerous, foregoing any pleasantries. "Care to explain the meaning of that theatrical performance on social media? You publicly insulted a member of this board, undermined a major charitable event we sponsored, and made this company the subject of idle gossip. It was reckless, unprofessional, and frankly, baffling." Victoria leaned forward, her voice like ice. "He didn't just insult me, Arthur. He made a fool of this entire company. He champions the work of some unknown amateur cook while alienating the very people we need to do business with. It shows a staggering lack of judgment. What were our clients, our investors, to think when they saw our CEO having a public meltdown over a plate of potatoes?" Julian remained standing, his hands resting calmly on the back of his chair. He let them vent, absorbing their righteous indignation without a flicker of emotion on his face. He had anticipated this ambush, had played it out in his mind a dozen times on the drive into the city. He waited until a lull in the attacks, a brief moment where they paused to draw breath for the next volley of accusations. "You're right," he said, his voice calm and steady, commanding the attention of the room. It was a public statement, and it was entirely intentional. A stunned silence descended upon the boardroom. Julian's calm admission had completely disarmed them. They had expected apologies, excuses, perhaps even a desperate attempt at backpedaling. Instead, they were met with a quiet, unshakable confidence that was far more unsettling. Victoria Sterling's eyes narrowed, her mind racing to recalibrate her attack. "Intentional?" she scoffed. "Recovering first. What could you possibly have intended to achieve, Julian, other than complete and utter chaos? Are you trying to deliberately sabotage your own reputation?" Julian finally moved, walking slowly around the table, his gaze meeting each board member's in turn. "What I intended," he said, his voice resonating with authority, "was to make a point about the core values of this company. You speak of our clients, Victoria. Our biggest upcoming project is the Peregrine Tower, a multi-billion-dollar residential development that we are marketing not just as a luxury building, but as a community built on authenticity and quality. We are selling a lifestyle, an idea. And that idea is that Thorn consolidated values, substance over style, integrity over image. My post wasn't about potatoes. It was a marketing message, a very public and, as it turns out, very effective one. It has been shared over 50,000 times. People are talking about Thorn Consolidated, not as a faceless corporation, but as a company with a point of view, with a soul." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final decisive blow. "And to prove that this isn't just empty talk, to show our clients and the world that we practice what we preach, I am doubling down. I'm officially hiring Olivia Campbell and her catering company to be the sole culinary provider for the Peregrine Tower launch event, our most important event of the year." The collective gasp in the room was audible. It was a move of such breathtaking audacity that for a moment no one knew how to react. He was not just defending his actions, he was escalating the situation to an almost unimaginable degree, tying the fate of their flagship project to the talents of the very woman they had dismissed and ridiculed. He had taken their attack and forged it into a weapon. The East Village felt like a different country compared to the rarefied air of Midtown. The streets were narrower, the buildings older, and clad in fire escapes, the air thick with a vibrant mix of street food, music, and the low hum of constant, chaotic life. Julian Thorn, dressed in a bespoke Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than Liv's rent for an entire year, felt conspicuously out of place as he navigated the sidewalk, dodging cyclists and pedestrians. He had gotten Olivia Campbell's address from a public business filing, a small act of corporate espionage that felt both necessary and intrusive. He found the building, a pre-war walk-up with a slightly battered front door, and pressed the buzzer for apartment 4B. A moment later, a wary, disembodied voice crackled through the intercom. "Yes? Who is it?" "Ms. Campbell. My name is Julian Thorn. I'd like to speak with you for a moment, if you have the time." There was a long, charged pause. Julian could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, the confusion and suspicion. He was the man from the LinkedIn post, the phantom defender she had only read about after. A friend had breathlessly forwarded her the link that morning. The post had left her reeling, a confusing cocktail of gratitude, bewilderment, and a deep-seated fear of what it all meant. Finally, the buzzer sounded, a harsh, grating noise that unlocked the door. He climbed 4 flights of winding, narrow stairs that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. She was waiting for him at the open door of her apartment, looking small and guarded. She was wearing faded jeans and a simple grey t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes, a deep, intelligent hazel, were filled with a profound and understandable mistrust. Her apartment, visible over her shoulder, was tiny but impeccably organized, with shelves overflowing with cookbooks and pots of fresh herbs lining the windowsill. It was a world away from his own stark, minimalist penthouse, and he felt a strange, unsettling pang of something he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but firm, not inviting him in. "I read your post, thank you. But I have a feeling you're not here just to receive my gratitude." Julian gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth in her statement. He appreciated her directness. It was a refreshing change from the sycophantic dance he was used to. "You're right, I'm not. May I come in for a moment? What I have to say is better discussed not in a hallway." Liv hesitated, her gaze flickering from his expensive, polished shoes to his impossibly confident posture. Every instinct she had, honed by a lifetime of being underestimated and overlooked, screamed at her to slam the door in his face. He represented a world that had just chewed her up and spat her out. But there was something in his eyes, not pity, but a flicker of genuine respect that made her reconsider. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter her small sanctuary. The space was immediately filled by his presence. He seemed too large, too refined for her cozy, cluttered world. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, careful not to disturb a stack of culinary magazines or a bowl of rising dough covered with a dish towel on the counter. "Miss Campbell," he began, getting straight to the point. "As you may have gathered from my post, I was at the gala the other night. I tasted your food. It was, without exaggeration, the best thing I have eaten all year." A faint blush colored Liv's cheeks, but her expression remained guarded. "Thank you," she murmured, still unsure of where this was heading. "My public statement of that fact has created a complicated situation within my company," he continued, his tone all business. "A situation I have chosen to resolve with a rather bold move. My company is launching its most significant real estate project in over a decade in 3 weeks' time. It's called the Peregrine Tower. The launch event will host over 500 of the city's most influential investors, politicians, and media personalities. The success of this project, and frankly, my continued position as CEO, depends heavily on the success of that night." He paused, his gaze intense. "I want you to cater it." Liv stared at him, convinced for a moment that she had misheard him, or that this was some kind of elaborate, cruel joke. Her cater an event for 500 of the most powerful people in New York, after she had just been spectacularly humiliated in front of a fraction of that number. The idea was so absurd, so utterly preposterous, that a small, hysterical laugh almost escaped her lips. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Thorne, with all due respect, did you not see what happened the other night? I was called an amateur. Your own board member, Victoria Sterling, practically had me thrown out. Why on earth would you risk everything on me?" It was the question he had been expecting, the logical, rational response to his insane proposal. He had seen the doubt and fear in her eyes, but he had also seen the flicker of a fighter, the resilience of someone who had been knocked down but was not yet broken. Because what Victoria Sterling and people like her fail to understand is that true quality isn't about shiny surfaces and empty labels, he explained, his voice softening slightly, losing its corporate edge. It's about passion. It's about honesty. Your food has that. My building has that. It's the same principle. I am not just offering you a job, Ms. Campbell. I am proposing a partnership. I am staking my reputation on the belief that authenticity will win, that your talent is real, and that people, the right people, will recognize it. He pulled a sleek, leather-bound folder from his briefcase and placed it on her small kitchen table. This is a contract. It offers a fee that I suspect will more than cover any outstanding financial obligations you might have. It gives you complete creative control. No committees, no second guessing, just you. And your food. But it's a high-stakes bet. If the event is a success, we both win spectacularly. If it fails, I will likely lose my company, and you will lose this opportunity." He looked at her, his expression stripped of all pretense, leaving only a raw, compelling vulnerability. "I understand if you say no. It's an incredible risk, but I'm asking you to take it with me. I need a fighter, Ms. Campbell. I need someone who believes in her own work as much as I now believe in it. The choice, of course, is entirely yours." The choice lay before Olivia Campbell like a chasm she had to leap across, the chasm between a safe, predictable and painful failure and a risk so audacious it bordered on madness. She sat on her small, worn sofa long after Julian Thorne had left, the sleek leather folder still resting on her coffee table, an impossibly elegant alien object in her cluttered lived-in apartment. The numbers on the contract were staggering, a sum that would not only pay for her father's physical therapy for the next several years, but could also provide the seed money for the small restaurant she had only ever dared to dream about. But the sheer scale of the risk was equally staggering. He was putting his career, his company, on the line for her, for the authenticity of her cooking. And if she failed, she would not only have her own spectacular humiliation to live with, but she would also have the weight of his ruin on her shoulders, a burden far heavier than any she had ever carried. She walked over to her kitchen counter, her hand instinctively reaching for a well-worn, hardcover book. It was her grandmother's recipe book, its pages yellowed and stained with years of use, a tangible chronicle of family history and culinary passion. She ran her fingers over the faded, familiar handwriting, and a sudden wave of clarity washed over her. This book, this food, was not about pretense or reputation. It was about love, about nourishment, about care. It was the only thing that had ever made her feel truly seen, truly valuable. Victoria Sterling had called her an amateur, but her grandmother had called her a force of nature. For years, Liv had been waiting for permission, waiting for validation from a world that had always treated her as an outsider. But Julian Thorne hadn't asked for permission to defend her. He had simply acted based on his own conviction. She realized that the greatest risk was not in taking this chance, but in shrinking away from it, in confirming every single one of Victoria's cruel pronouncements. Her father was counting on her. She had a chance to save him, to give him a future, to finally own her own talent and her own narrative. The fear was still a tight knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She took a deep breath, picked up her phone, and dialed the number on the contract, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Mr. Thorne? It's Liv Campbell. I'm in." Last first meeting to plan the Peregrine Tower launch felt less like a collaboration and more like a collision of two separate universes. Julian had suggested meeting at his office, but Liv, with a newfound boldness, had insisted on her apartment. "I need my kitchen to think," she had explained, and Julian, to her surprise, had readily agreed. He arrived with a meticulously prepared 10-page document titled Event, Logistics and Timetable, a series of color-coded spreadsheets, and a team of a dozen. Assistants on standby, ready to spring into action. Liv, on the other hand, had a single spiral notebook filled with scrawled recipes, a dozen cookbooks laid out on her small kitchen table, and a deep-seated instinct that told her which flavors would work and which wouldn't. The humorous clash was immediate and absolute. Julian laid out a Gantt chart detailing every single step, from ingredient sourcing to final plating, with deadlines measured in minutes. "We'll need a weekly progress report. Of course, with projected costs and a comprehensive risk assessment," he stated, his voice all business. Liv stared at the document, a bemused smile playing on her lips. "I don't do reports, Mr. Thorne. I taste things, I feel things, I cook. That's my process." She picked up a jar of pickled carrots from her fridge, a bright orange beacon in the corporate chaos. I have this idea for a savory tartlet. A little bite of this with a hint of cinnamon and something earthy. I'm not sure what yet. It just feels right. Julian's expression was a study in profound, controlled bewilderment. He was a man who built skyscrapers, who moved millions with a single signature. He understood blueprints, not feelings, or just right. "Feelings are not a metric, Ms. Campbell," he responded, a hint of his ingrained cynicism breaking through. "And intuition is not a substitute for a solid plan. We have a budget and a very firm deadline." Liv laughed, a light, genuine sound that cut through his rigidity. "Well, then you'll just have to trust me, won't you? This entire thing is an act of faith, isn't it? You trusted my food. Now you have to trust my process." Julian held her gaze for a long moment, a slow, grudging smile finally touching his lips. He folded up the pristine Gantt chart and put it back in his briefcase, a silent, powerful concession. "All right, Liv," he said, using her first name for the first time, a small but significant shift. "Show me how you think. But I get to ask, and questions, a lot of questions." Their collaboration fell into a strange, compelling rhythm. Julian, the master of order and control, found himself following Liv, the mistress of creative chaos, through the labyrinthine streets of New York. He learned to navigate the bustling, aromatic pandemonium of the Union Square Green Market, a place where he was utterly, comically, out of his element. He, who was accustomed to sourcing steel beams and tons of concrete, was now being taught to select the perfect heirloom tomato, to feel the difference between a crisp radish and a mealy one. Liv was in her element here, her movements fluid and confident as she bartered with a gruff-looking farmer for fresh asparagus, her face alight with a passion that Julian had only ever seen in the eyes of his most ambitious project managers. He watched as she took a moment, with closed eyes, to smell a bundle of fresh rosemary, a look of serene concentration on her face that was so genuine, so devoid of pretense. It was breathtaking. He felt his corporate armor begin to crack around the edges, the cynical wall he had built between himself and the rest of the world starting to crumble under the weight of her simple, profound authenticity. But then, as a farmer's dog barked loudly and a cyclist narrowly missed him, Julian stumbled, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Liv saw it, and a shadow of doubt passed over her own expression. The polished, unassailable CEO from the gala was gone, replaced by a man who looked flustered and lost. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with an unexpected touch of concern. He nodded, but his jaw was tight. "I'm fine. This is just a lot." He gestured vaguely at the vibrant sensory overload of the market. "I'm used to things being predictable, controlled." She looked at him for a long moment, a small, sad smile on her lips. "You really do live in a glass tower, don't you?" she mused softly. "You see the city, but you don't actually feel it." The words stung, a quiet but accurate assessment of his isolated existence. He realized in that moment that this partnership wasn't just about his company or her career. It was an act of personal excavation, forcing him to confront a world he had long ago chosen to observe from a great and cynical distance. Without thinking, as if to shed the very corporate identity she had just called out, he reached into his pocket and unclasped his expensive Swiss-made watch, a subtle but powerful symbol of his controlled, highly scheduled life, and slid it into his pocket. "Show me," he said, his voice softer now. "Show me the things I can't see from up there." That night, back in Liv's cozy kitchen, a space now filled with the warmth of a simmering broth and the soft glow of a single overhead light, the professional boundaries that had so strictly defined their relationship began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, tentative intimacy. Julian sat on a stool at her counter, watching her work with a quiet fascination as she chopped vegetables with an effortless precision. He had asked about her father, a question that had been lingering in his mind since their first meeting. Liv stopped chopping for a moment, her knife resting on the cutting board, and let out a long, weary sigh. "He's a carpenter," she began, her voice low and filled with a raw, fierce love. "He built things with his hands, tables, chairs, an entire playhouse for me when I was a kid. He was so proud of what he could create. And now, he can barely walk without help. The accident, it took a piece of him, a piece of his dignity. This money, Julian, it isn't just for physical therapy. It's for him to feel whole again. It's for him to be able to use his hands, his body to build things again." The vulnerability in her voice was a stark contrast to her usual guarded demeanor, and Julian felt a deep, unfamiliar pang of empathy. "My grandmother, she was a baker," he found himself saying, the words coming out almost involuntarily, a confession he had never shared with anyone in his corporate life. "She made the best bread in Queens, the real stuff, with a crunchy crust and a soft, warm center. I used to think she was crazy. She'd spend hours kneading dough, talking to it like it was a person. She told me the most important ingredient was love, and I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. I was a cynical kid even then. I just saw the long hours, the meager profits. I saw a life of hard work that never got anywhere. I told myself I would never live a life like that." He let out a dry, bitter laugh. "I went into construction and finance because I wanted to build things that would last. Things that would be seen, things that people would recognize, but I built them from the outside in. She built them from the inside out. Your food, it tastes like her baking felt. It's honest. It's a connection to something real." The silence that followed was not awkward, but profound. It was a shared space of unspoken understanding, a recognition of their own wounded, hungry hearts, their shared search for something authentic in a world of artifice. The air in the kitchen was no longer just filled with the scent of simmering broth. It was now imbued with the subtle, intoxicating perfume of vulnerability and trust. Unbeknownst to them, while Julian and Liv were forging a tentative truce between their two disparate worlds, a calculated plot was being hatched in a sterile modern office just a few miles away. Victoria Sterling, having watched the social media storm and the growing media interest in Julian Thorne's audacious public bet, was no longer satisfied with merely undermining his reputation. The professional corporate attack had failed. Julian had used it to his advantage, positioning himself as a maverick, a champion of authenticity. She had also noticed the subtle change in his social media posts, the occasional, almost imperceptible warmth in his tone when he mentioned the event. And she had seen the photographs, paparazzi shots of Julian Thorne, the notoriously reclusive CEO, laughing with a smiling Liv Campbell at the farmer's market, their heads close together over a basket of produce. The sight filled her with a cold, precise rage. This wasn't just a business move anymore. It was personal. He was not just defying her. He was replacing her world of carefully curated perfection with this messy, authentic nonsense. It was a rejection of everything she stood for. She couldn't attack his business plan directly without making a fool of herself. But she could attack the heart of their partnership, the source of this infuriating authenticity. She picked up her phone, her fingers tapping out a number she hadn't dialed in years. It belonged to a man named Gerald, an old family acquaintance who ran one of the city's largest, most influential food supply conglomerates. He had a long-standing, quiet rivalry with Liv's chosen supplier, a smaller, family-run operation with a reputation for quality but little leverage in a market dominated by corporate giants. Victoria's voice, when she spoke, was as smooth and sharp as broken glass. "Gerald, darling, it's Victoria. I need a favor. I hear you have a situation with a new, up-and-coming competitor." Her words were a carefully constructed web of insinuations and veiled threats, hinting at a future of lost contracts and corporate isolation. The message was clear: sabotage Liv's supply, and she would make it worth his while. Victoria ended the call with a victorious, chilling smile. It was a perfect, untraceable plan. It wasn't a corporate attack. It was a ghost in the machine, a logistical nightmare that would send Julian's perfect plan crashing down. A delicious, private form of revenge that would be all the more devastating because it would seem to be a mere, unfortunate coincidence. The final 72 hours before the Peregrine Tower launch event was a maelstrom of organized chaos. Julian, now fully immersed in Liv's world, was a human errand runner, his corporate efficiency repurposed to ferry produce, coordinate deliveries, and field calls from overeager media outlets. He found a new kind of satisfaction in the work, a sense of tangible accomplishment that was absent from the abstract world of financial projections. Liv, in her small kitchen, was a whirlwind of creative energy, a chef possessed by her craft. She moved with a purpose he had come to admire, her hands a blur as she meticulously prepared sauces, braised meats, and assembled hundreds of miniature tartlets. The centerpiece of the entire menu, the item that would make or break the night, was a dish that had haunted her since the gala, a tribute to her victory over Victoria's cruel words. An exquisite, deconstructed shepherd's pie, but with a new, elevated twist. This time, instead of lamb, she was using a rare, specific cut of Wagyu beef, slow braised to a melting tenderness, to be served on a velvety potato and truffle puree. Julian had found a specialty supplier for the beef, a small, exclusive farm in upstate New York that only provided to a handful of elite restaurants. The entire success of the night, the culmination of all their work and all their risks, was riding on this one crucial ingredient. It was scheduled to be delivered the following morning, a mere 8 hours before the event was set to begin. Julian felt a rare, uncharacteristic sense of peace. The plan was solid, the menu was inspired, and their partnership had found its footing, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared vulnerability. For the first time, he felt something more than just professional obligation. He felt invested, heart and soul, in their shared success. The quiet calm before the storm was almost as unnerving as the storm itself. At 7 a.m. on the day of the launch, just as Liv was brewing her first pot of coffee, the landline in her apartment rang. Its harsh, jarring sound, a shocking intrusion into the morning's quiet serenity. It was a number she didn't recognize, and she answered with a wary sense of foreboding. The voice on the other end was the gruff, apologetic voice of Mr. Henderson, the owner of the small, specialty meat farm. "Liv, it's David Henderson. I'm so sorry, but I have some terrible news. The delivery, it's gone. The entire shipment of Wagyu was diverted. An error at the depot, a simple mix-up," they said. "It was picked up by the wrong truck this morning, and it's already on its way to a different client, halfway across the state." The words hit Liv like a physical blow. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor, the voice on the other end still murmuring apologies. The centerpiece, the crucial, irreplaceable ingredient, gone. The feeling of invisibility and shame that had consumed her at the gala came rushing back, a dark, suffocating tide. This wasn't a mix-up. This was a direct, targeted attack. This was Victoria Sterling's ghost in the machine, her perfectly calibrated sabotage. She sank to the floor, her back against the counter, the full weight of the disaster settling upon her. The money for her father, Julian's career, all of it gone. She felt a profound and desolate sense of defeat. She hadn't been defeated by her lack of talent, but by the relentless, cold-blooded cruelty of a world that refused to be beaten. She wasn't angry. She was just empty. With a trembling hand, she picked up her cell phone. Julian Thorne's name, a burning beacon on the screen. She had to call him. She had to tell him. "Julian." Her voice was a thin, hollow sound. "You need to save yourself. The meat, it's gone. I'm so sorry. I told you this was a bad idea. I am so sorry, but you need to walk away. You can still save your company." Her voice broke. and for the first time in their partnership, all pretense of composure was gone. The only sound was the ragged sound of her breathing, a testament to her utter defeat. She had nothing left to give, nothing left to improvise with. All of their work, all of their hopes had come to a devastating, predictable end. The air in the Thorne-consolidated boardroom was thick with an almost unbearable tension. Julian sat at the mahogany table, the chairman, Arthur Vance, just concluding a scathing, meticulously worded indictment of his recent actions. "The board is in unanimous agreement, Julian," Arthur stated, his voice a low and final rumble of authority. "Your stunt on social media has created a liability we simply cannot tolerate. We have lost investor confidence, and at a time when we need a united front for the Peregrine Tower launch, you have shown a shocking disregard for professional decorum. The consensus is that it is no longer in this company's best interest to have you at the helm. We're asking for your resignation, effective immediately." Victoria Sterling, seated across from Julian, wore a small, triumphant smile, the look of a predator who has finally cornered her prey. Julian listened to the words, the familiar pronouncements of a world that valued control and predictable outcomes above all else, and felt a profound sense of exhaustion. He was about to respond, to fight, to make one last desperate stand for a principle he had only just discovered he believed in, when his phone buzzed. It was a call from Liv. He glanced at the screen, a flicker of something in her name. Not just an employee, not just a business partner, but a person, making him hesitate. He felt the pull of the room, the $100 million decision that was about to be made, the weight of his entire career hanging in the balance. Then he felt the pull of her, the small, quiet, authentic voice he knew was on the other end of the line, and he made his choice. He let the phone ring for a few more seconds before taking it out of his pocket and answering it. A silent act of defiance that earned him a gasp from the other board members. He held the phone to his ear, and the sound of Liv's broken voice, a small, hollow whisper of defeat, hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling, "the meat, it's gone. I'm so sorry. I told you this was a bad idea. You need to walk away. You can still save your company." A cold, precise rage, unlike anything he had ever felt before, coursed through him. It was a confirmation of his deepest fears, a proof of Victoria Sterling's casual cruelty. He hung up the phone without another word. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on Victoria's triumphant face, his own expression a chilling mask of calm resolve. "You can have your company, Arthur," he said, his voice quiet but echoing with a power that silenced the room. "I came here today to build something real, and it's clear that this room is full of people who are only interested in building a facade." He walked to the door, a palpable shock rippling through the stunned board members. His hand on the doorknob, he turned back for one last look at Victoria, who now wore a look of confused victory, her moment of triumph tainted by his inexplicable composure. "You can have it all," he said, his voice a low, final whisper. "But you'll never understand what it means to build something that has a soul." And then he walked out, leaving behind a world he had spent his entire life trying to conquer, and walking toward the only person who had ever shown him what it was to truly live. The moment Liv hung up the phone, a desolate, suffocating emptiness settled upon her. The shame from the gala was an open wound, and this new failure, this act of cold, calculated sabotage, felt like salt poured into it. She sat on her kitchen floor, the phone clutched in her hand, watching the minutes tick by on her oven clock, waiting for Julian's call, waiting for the inevitable. His angry, disappointed voice telling her that this was over, that she had proven his critics right, that she had cost him everything, but the call never came. Instead, an hour later, a heavy knock sounded on her door. She didn't move, convinced it was just a delivery or a neighbor or someone else who didn't matter. The knocking persisted, more insistent this time, and a voice, deep and familiar, called her name. "Liv? Liv, it's me. Open the door." She slowly, reluctantly, dragged herself to the door and unlocked it, her eyes red-rimmed and her face streaked with tears. Julian Thorne stood in the hallway, his pristine suit slightly rumpled, his face a grim mask of resolve. He didn't say a word, didn't ask what was wrong, didn't have to. He simply stepped inside, saw the devastation in her eyes and the phone on the floor, and understood everything. He walked over to the counter and began to calmly, systematically open her refrigerator. "Okay," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle and yet filled with a fierce energy. "Tell me what we have. We've got less than 6 hours until the event. The centerpiece is gone, so we're going to create a new one. Right here, right now. What do we have?" Liv stared at him in disbelief, her mind still in a fog of despair. "Julian, you don't understand. It's over. The Wagyu. It was the whole point. It was what tied the whole menu together. We can't." "No." He cut her off, his eyes locking with hers, a raw, powerful sincerity in their depths. "We can. This is what you do, Liv. This is what you're good at. You improvise. You take what you have and you make it into something beautiful. That's the whole point of this, isn't it? It's not about the expensive ingredients. It's about the heart. And we still have that. Let's start with the basics. What's in the freezer?" Her mind, still numb with grief, slowly, hesitantly began to stir. The fighter in her, the part of her that had never truly given up, felt a faint flicker of a flame. She looked at him, truly saw him, standing in her messy kitchen. His expensive suit now dusted with flour, his eyes filled not with pity, but with a fierce, unwavering faith in her. She finally, slowly, began to list the remaining ingredients. The next few hours were a frantic, breathless, and creatively chaotic blur. They worked as one, an unspoken, instinctive choreography unfolding in the confines of Liv's small kitchen. They found a few packages of a lesser-known cut of beef, skirt steak, that Liv had purchased for a family dinner, and a small forgotten bag of Jerusalem artichokes in the back of her crisper drawer. It wasn't the Wagyu, not even close, but Julian didn't flinch. "It's honest," he said, the word having taken on a new, profound meaning for him. "It's real." They worked with a furious, joyous energy, chopping, searing, and simmering, the kitchen filling with the intoxicating scent of garlic, rosemary, and something else. Something that felt like hope. Julian, the CEO, was now her sous chef, his quick, decisive corporate mind repurposed. For the fine, delicate work of a kitchen, he was a master of efficiency, and he was able to follow her every command, her every intuition. "Get the thyme, the butter, the salt. We need more salt." Their movements were a desperate dance against time, the scent of the cooking steak and roasted artichokes filling her apartment, an intoxicating promise that something beautiful was being born out of the ashes of their defeat. They had no time for grand speeches or emotional declarations. Their entire conversation was a string of short, urgent commands, punctuated by small, shared smiles, the unspoken knowledge that they were not just making a meal, but creating a new future for themselves. Julian, in a single, fluid motion, took off his expensive jacket and began to meticulously peel the artichokes, his movements now as natural and confident as Liv's. He had shed his corporate armor entirely, entering her world with a genuine, unpretentious vulnerability that was far more powerful than any million-dollar contract. They were a team, a single, unstoppable force, two people from two different worlds, united by a shared purpose and a deep-seated belief that they could turn this final, devastating sabotage into their greatest triumph. As the final minutes ticked by, they plated the dishes, the new centerpiece a rustic, beautiful thing that felt more them than the original plan ever could have. The construction site for the Peregrine Tower, a cathedral of gleaming glass and Polished steel was transformed for the launch event into a breathtakingly elegant showroom. Hundreds of investors, media moguls and city officials mingled, their voices a polite, murmuring backdrop to the sleek, modern aesthetic. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Julian and Liv, dressed in simple, elegant clothes, were a quiet, calm eye in the center of the storm. The new dishes were an instant, undeniable hit. The roasted skirt steak with the creamy Jerusalem artichoke puree was not what people expected, but its honesty, its deep, earthy flavor was a revelation. The critics who were there in full force found themselves scrambling for the right words, their polished pretense giving way to a grudging, genuine admiration. As the night wore on, a single microphone was placed on a stage in the center of the room. The moment had arrived. Julian, with Liv standing just a few feet behind him, walked onto the stage, the crowd's chatter dying down to a hush. He began his speech with a corporate flourish, speaking of market trends and return on investment, the words of a man who was still in control. And then, his voice softening, he began to tell a story. He told them about the brave, honest young chef who had been publicly humiliated for her authenticity. He told them about the simple, powerful act of a dish that had a soul. And he told them about how, on the morning of this most important night, that very dish had been sabotaged, its key ingredient deliberately stolen. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a wave of shock and disbelief. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience, before finally turning and gesturing for Liv to join him on the stage. She hesitated for a moment, the ghost of her humiliation at the gala still haunting her, but Julian's hand was outstretched, a silent, powerful invitation. She took it, and he pulled her onto the stage with him. The crowd murmured with surprise. "What you just ate tonight," Julian said, his voice now booming with a powerful conviction, "was a new dish. It was something we created just hours ago, using what we had. It was born not of a meticulous plan, but of passion, of improvisation, and of a belief that true value lies not in a perfect blueprint, but in a courageous heart. It was a dish born of triumph over sabotage. And that," he declared, his voice full of a dramatic, heartfelt sincerity, "is the very principle this company is now built on. We are not here to sell you a product. We are here to offer you a partnership built on authenticity, on resilience, on a willingness to fight for what you believe in, no matter the cost." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pride that made her heart swell. "And so, to make it clear that this isn't just empty corporate rhetoric, I want to announce something. Liv's catering business is not just a partner for this event. It is our long-term official food partner for all future Thorn consolidated projects." A thunderous applause erupted, a mix of genuine excitement and stunned surprise. He had turned a disaster into a public act of defiant faith, a testament to his belief in her, in them. He held her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in a small private gesture of connection as the flashes of 1,000 cameras captured their shared moment of victory. They had not just won a contract, they had won their dignity back, their careers, and the future of her father. The two worlds had not just collided, they had merged into a single, beautiful and powerful new reality. The epilogue, a year and a half later, was a quiet testament to their triumph. David Campbell, Liv's father, was now able to walk again, his physical therapy a success, a testament to the money that had flowed from Julian's initial reckless bet. He could now be found in the back of their new restaurant, his hands strong again, building intricate wooden frames for the art that lined the walls. The restaurant, located in a quiet, vibrant corner of the East Village, was called The Hearth. Its menu was a reflection of Liv's journey, a celebration of honest, soul-nourishing food, and it was quickly becoming one of the most acclaimed culinary destinations in the city. The sign above the door was a simple, elegant piece of woodwork crafted by her father. Julian Thorn had not just invested in her business, He had become her partner in every sense of the word. His role as CEO of Thorne Consolidated was secure and more profitable than ever. But his real work, his true passion, was now this small restaurant, this place where authenticity was the only currency that mattered. He was no longer the isolated, cynical man in a glass tower. He was a man who knew the difference between a mealy radish and a perfect one, who appreciated the value of honest hard work, and who had learned that true vulnerability was the greatest strength of all. Their love story wasn't one of rescue. It was one of mutual discovery. He had found his soul, and she had found her voice. The once tarnished silver platter from the gala now hung on a wall in their restaurant. A beautiful, powerful reminder of where they had started. A symbol of their shared humiliation that they had reclaimed and transformed into a symbol of their enduring, authentic and unconditional love.